My name is George Whitman, and last Christmas I set the table for a family dinner that never happened. I roasted the beef, polished the silver, and folded the napkins the way my late wife Laura always did. But instead of hearing my son's car in the driveway, a courier handed me an envelope. Inside was a short note that cut deeper than any blade they chose someone else's table over mine. That was the night I learned abandonment can feel colder than December snow. What my son and his wife didn't know was that Laura had left me a secret one that would change everything. Before we begin, I want to ask, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories. I still remember that Christmas morning as if it were yesterday. The air outside was sharp, brittle with frost, while inside I worked for hours to create the warmth Laura used to make so naturally. I told myself that if I recreated every detail she loved, the gold lights on the porch, the old china set, the rosemary roast beef, then maybe David and Melissa would feel the same sense of home. I wanted them to see that even without Laura, her spirit lingered in the details. The table looked perfect when I finished. For a moment I allowed myself to imagine them walking through the door, David's smile breaking through the cold, Melissa setting her purse down, and the three of us sitting together the way families are supposed to on Christmas. That fantasy lasted right up until I heard footsteps on the porch. I hurried to the door, my heart pounding with the relief of expectation. But when I opened it, there was no David, no Melissa. Just a young courier with a red windbreaker shifting impatiently, holding a thin envelope with my name on it. He barely looked at me as he shoved it into my hand. "Delivery for George Whitman," he said before turning back to his car. I stood there staring at the envelope like it weighed 100 pounds. My fingers hesitated on the flap, already knowing good news never comes folded so thin. Inside, Melissa's handwriting stared up at me. Neat, perfect loops as cold as the winter air. "George, we decided to spend Christmas at my mom's this year. Hope you understand. Love, Melissa." That was it. No Merry Christmas. No we'll come next week, not even a call. My son's name wasn't even there, just hers. I stood frozen on the threshold, lights twinkling around me, the snow glowing under the soft porch light, and realized I wasn't forgotten. I was excluded. When I stepped back into the house, the warmth of the fire mocked me. The table glittered under the chandelier, roast beef steaming on the platter, garlic mashed potatoes, smooth and creamy, the pecan pie resting proudly on the counter. I sat at the head of the table, lifted my fork, and took one bite. It was perfect, seasoned, just right, but in my mouth, it tasted like nothing. Loneliness had a way of stripping flavor out of everything. By the third bite, I set my fork down and blew out the candles. The silence pressed down like a weight. For the first time in my life, Christmas didn't feel like Christmas at all. I walked to the window and stared out at the snow. Somewhere not too far away, David and Melissa were laughing at another table. And here I was, surrounded by Laura's traditions, left with nothing but shadows. Tell me, have you ever felt invisible in your own family, like you were erased from the very table you built? I pushed the untouched plates aside and tried to convince myself it was just one holiday, just a scheduling mix-up. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't the first time David and Melissa had chosen elsewhere, only now they didn't even bother hiding it. I poured myself a glass of sweet tea, sat back at the head of the table, and stared at the empty chairs. Every candle flicker seemed to whisper Laura's absence. Every polished fork reminded me she wasn't there to insist that family came first. Out of habit, I reached for my phone. Not because I expected a message, they had already made their choice, but because I needed a distraction from the silence. As I scrolled, my chest tightened. Melissa's mother had posted a picture online. A long table dressed with red linens, wine glasses, sparkling faces glowing with laughter. At the far end sat David, his hand resting on Melissa's, smiling like he hadn't in years. The caption cut like glass, so grateful for a house full of family this Christmas. Family. My son, at someone else's table. I set the phone down screen face down against the wood. I didn't need to look any longer. The image was already burned into me. My mind drifted back to when David was a boy racing down the hallway in his pajamas. Laura pulling hot cinnamon rolls out of the oven. Those mornings were loud and messy, filled with wrapping paper and powdered sugar in the air. Back then, Christmas didn't need to be perfect. It just needed us. Now perfection sat on the table untouched, and I was alone. I blew out the last candle and packed away most of the food. Still, I left the pecan pie on the counter. Laura always said, "Leave dessert out, someone might drop by." I knew no one would, but I couldn't cover it. Maybe some part of me still believed in her little tradition, even if it was only habit. I moved to the living room, the recliner creaking under me, and stared at the tree in the corner. The star on top was the one David made in 3rd grade. One of the points had broken off years ago, but Laura always insisted it was perfect as it was. Tonight, it felt like a cruel reminder of a time when love was enough to fill a house. My eyes drifted to Laura's old chair, the knitting basket still sitting beside it. Half-finished yarn trailed out, like time had stopped the moment she passed. The house felt too quiet, even with the fire snapping. The ticking clock in the hall seemed louder than it ever had. I pressed my hands together, elbows on my knees, and tried to swallow the ache in my chest. Laura would have told me not to take it personally, but she would have known better. This wasn't about one dinner, it was about being replaced. Tell me, if the people you love most left you behind on the day meant for family, would you forgive, or would you finally see the truth? That night I tried to eat again, but every bite turned to dust in my mouth. I wrapped the roast in foil, slid the potatoes into containers, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the pie. It sat uncovered on the counter, daring me to admit no one would ever stop by. I turned off the chandelier one bulb at a time and walked into the bedroom. On the dresser sat a framed photo from our last Christmas together. Laura's smile was warm, eternal, while David and Melissa looked polite, already distant, their plates barely touched, because they'd eaten elsewhere before arriving late. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at that frozen image until my eyes blurred with tears I hadn't planned on shedding. When I finally lay down, the space beside me felt colder than usual. I tossed through the night, staring at the ceiling shadows from the tree branches, scraping across the walls like reminders of what was gone. Sleep didn't come, not really. When morning light finally broke through the curtains, I rose more exhausted than before. I made coffee the way Laura always did, with a spoonful of cinnamon sprinkled in, but it only deepened the ache of her absence. I stepped outside, the air sharp and biting, filling my lungs with a kind of pain that felt cleaner than the one inside my chest. Frost clung to the grass, the bird bath was frozen solid. Laura had always insisted on checking the bird feeder, even in the coldest mornings. "They still need to eat, George," she'd say, smiling as she scattered seeds. "Even when no one else is watching." Without thinking, I followed the little stone path to the feeder. It swayed gently in the wind, empty. My hand reached up to steady it, and that's when I felt it, a corner of paper wedged between the roof and the post. My heart stuttered. Slowly, I pulled it free. An envelope. My name written across the front in the familiar looping script I hadn't seen in nearly 6 months. Laura's handwriting. I froze, breath clouding in the winter air. The edges were weathered, but the flap was sealed tight. I turned it over my thumb, tracing the letters. Just George. Not Mr. Whitman. Not Dad. Just the way she'd written birthday cards and grocery notes. The date in the corner hit me harder than the cold one week before she died. My knees nearly buckled under the weight of it. I stood there in the frozen yard, gripping that envelope like a lifeline, scanning the street, as if someone might appear to explain how it got there. But no one came. Just me, the frost, and the silence. I carried it inside, set it gently on the kitchen table, and stared at it like it might vanish if I blinked. For the first time since David's note, my pulse quickened, not from grief, but from something else entirely. A sense that Laura was still here, guiding me toward something I wasn't meant to ignore. Tell me if you found a letter from someone you loved, written right before they passed. Would you open it right away, or hold it like a secret too heavy to touch? I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the envelope as if Laura herself had set it there moments ago. My fingers trembled when I finally broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, her unmistakable handwriting flowing across the page. If you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped wouldn't. Go to my desk, the top drawer. There's more. That was all. No greeting, no farewell. Just a directive. My throat tightened. Laura had seen something coming, and she had prepared for it. The chair scraped against the floor as I rose and walked down the hall. Laura's desk had been untouched since the day she passed. Her pen cup still sat in the corner, her reading glasses perched on a crossword book, a little ceramic dish full of paper clips, waiting like she'd be back any moment. Kneeling down, I pulled the top drawer open. At first it looked ordinary stationery notepads, a half-used pack of stamps. But when I ran my hand along the bottom, my fingers caught on something taped beneath the wood. Carefully, I peeled it free. Another envelope, thicker this time, with a small brass key clipped to the outside. My heart pounded as I unfolded the pages inside. It was a deed. My name printed boldly across the top, tied to an address I didn't recognize, Hendersonville, a small town 40 minutes away. Alongside it was a note in Laura's hand. George, if David ever shuts you out, this will make sense. You'll find everything you need at the place this key opens. It's yours. Always was. You just didn't know it. I sat back on my heels, stunned. She had hidden a property from me our whole lives together, and she never mentioned it. Why keep such a secret? Unless she had seen the rift between me and our son growing long before I wanted to admit it. I turned the key over in my hand, smooth and cool, worn from use, yet polished clean. She hadn't left this by accident. This was deliberate. I thought about calling Carl, my neighbor and oldest friend, but the idea of explaining all this over the phone felt wrong. This wasn't something to be told, it was something I needed to see. I went to the bedroom, pulled out my overnight bag, and packed it like a man preparing for battle. A change of clothes, a flashlight, my wallet, and the thermos Laura always insisted I carry on long drives. As I zipped the bag shut, my eyes fell on her old blue cardigan draped over the chair. I reached out, smoothing the fabric with my palm. You thought ahead, didn't you? I whispered into the empty room. The morning sun had barely lifted when I climbed into my car. The key felt heavy in my pocket, like it carried not just metal, but answers. The highway stretched out before me, lined with bare winter trees and memories I couldn't escape. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't dared to feel since Laura died. Purpose. Tell me, if the person you loved most left you a hidden key and a warning, would you follow it, or would you be too afraid of what you might find? The drive to Hendersonville felt both endless and urgent. The winter sun sat low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen fields as my old sedan hummed along the quiet highway. Each mile carried me deeper into questions I couldn't answer. Why had Laura hidden this from me? Why had she thought David might one day shut me out? She'd always seen things clearer than I did, especially when it came to people. Maybe she had noticed what I'd been too blind to accept, that David's loyalty was shifting, bending to Melissa's influence long before I dared to admit it. The town appeared suddenly like something out of another time. A row of modest shops lined the main street, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a hardware store with a hand-painted window, a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The address on the deed led me past the edge of town, down a gravel road tucked behind tall pines. My heart beat heavier the closer I came, the key like a stone in my pocket. When the mailbox numbers matched, I slowed to a stop. Before me sat a small white house with blue shutters perched on a stone porch. It wasn't grand, but it had a dignity to it, like it had been waiting all this time. The front steps creaked under my boots as I climbed them, the winter air sharp in my lungs. I slid the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, like it belonged there. The door opened with a soft click, and I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet, like a place long cared for. The living room held a wooden mantel lined with framed photos, some I recognized, others I'd never seen. Laura smiling on a beach. Laura holding a cup of coffee on a porch I now realized was this very one. My throat tightened. She had been here in this house building something for me without ever saying a word. On the coffee table lay a folded note. My hands shook as I opened it. "This is yours in case they ever forget who you are." The words hit me like a hammer. This wasn't just about property. This was about identity, dignity, the core of who I was. Laura had seen the drift in David, the quiet dominance of Melissa, and instead of confronting it head-on, she had given me armor. A refuge that no one could take no matter how hard they tried. I sat in the armchair by the window, staring out at the yard where a birdhouse stood beneath a bare tree. The quiet wasn't hollow here, it was peaceful, intentional. For the first time in months, I felt Laura's presence not as a memory, but as a force guiding me forward. My grief didn't vanish, but it shifted. This house, this key, this hidden gift, it was her way of reminding me that I was not powerless. Tell me if you discovered your spouse had built a secret safeguard just for you. Would you see it as betrayal for keeping it hidden, or as love for giving you strength when you needed it most? The key never left my pocket after that first visit. I kept running my thumb along its edges, as if it were some kind of talisman, a reminder that Laura had prepared me for more than I realized. When I locked the front door of that Hendersonville house, I knew I wasn't just closing it, I was claiming it. The words she had left on the coffee table echoed in my mind. "This is yours, in case they ever forget who you are." That sentence carried more weight than the deed itself. For years, I'd told myself that family was enough, that David would always be my son, and nothing could change that. But now I knew Laura had seen the cracks forming. She'd built this refuge not as a gift, but as a shield. I returned home that evening with the cabin key still burning in my hand like a second heartbeat. The house that once felt like a mausoleum after Laura's passing now felt different. I wasn't just a widower staring at shadows, I was a man holding proof that I still mattered, that someone had believed in my worth enough to protect it. That night, I pulled out the deed again, tracing my name where it was printed in bold. Hendersonville was mine, solely mine. The next morning, I walked over to Carl's hardware store, the envelope tucked under my arm. Carl had been my friend for 30 years, the kind of man you can trust to keep a secret without needing to swear it. His flannel shirt was dusted with sawdust, and the smell of fresh-cut wood filled the shop. "George," he said, squinting at me, "you look like a man carrying something heavy." I laid the deed on the counter. "Tell me what you see." Carl pulled out his reading glasses, slid them on, and scanned the document. His brow furrowed. "Well, Albie, this place is in your name alone. No co-owner listed, no trust, no liens. Laura set this up clean, separate from everything else. He looked up, his eyes sharper than usual. She knew exactly what she was doing. "What do you mean?" I asked. Carl tapped the page. "People don't go to the trouble of separating property unless they're protecting it. From taxes, from creditors, or from family disputes. George, your wife wasn't just giving you a house, she was giving you leverage. Something no one else could touch." I stood there in silence, the words sinking deeper than I wanted to admit. I had spent Christmas staring at an empty chair and a note that felt like a dismissal. But Laura had left me something entirely different, proof that I wasn't forgotten. Proof that she believed my place was worth safeguarding, even if my own son turned his back. As I folded the deed and slid it back into the envelope, Carl's words stayed with me. Family disputes. Was that what Laura had seen coming all along? Tell me if your late spouse foresaw betrayal and left you hidden protection. Would you take it as a warning to prepare, or as a challenge to prove everyone else wrong? The next day I drove back out to Hendersonville, this time with steadier hands and a sharper eye. I wasn't just visiting anymore. I was investigating. If Laura had gone to such lengths to hide this place, then every detail might carry meaning. When I opened the front door, the cedar scent welcomed me again, steady and grounding. I walked through each room slowly, almost reverently. The living room held the photos I'd seen before, but now I studied them carefully. Laura on the porch. Laura laughing at the beach. Laura looking at peace in this very house. I realized she had spent time here alone, quietly preparing something she never told me about. It stung at first that she hadn't shared this, but the sting gave way to something else. Trust. She had known I would need it someday, even if I didn't understand why until now. The kitchen was simple, but everything was in order. The pantry was neatly stocked with rice, pasta, and canned goods, all still good. On the inside of the cabinet door, taped neatly, was a grocery list in her handwriting. Coffee, bread, eggs, sugar. I traced the ink with my fingertips, hearing her voice as clearly as if she were in the room with me. It wasn't just food she'd listed. It was comfort, routine, proof of a life she wanted me to continue. Down the hall, I opened a bedroom door and found a quilt folded at the foot of the bed. She had sewn it herself. I recognized the pattern from her old sewing basket. In another room, stacked neatly against the wall, were boxes labeled in her handwriting, "George's Things." My pulse quickened. Inside, I found photo albums, books, and even some of her old letters tied with string. At the bottom of one box sat a small lockbox. No key in sight. I set it aside, knowing Laura wouldn't have left something like that without purpose. Back in the living room, I dropped into the armchair by the window. The view stretched out to a yard that would burst into flowers come spring. A birdhouse stood near a bare tree, swaying in the winter breeze. I sat there for a long time, realizing that this house wasn't just a safeguard, it was a message. Laura had created a place that was entirely mine, somewhere untouched by anyone else's influence. She had given me something David and Melissa could never claim: independence. As I locked the door behind me that afternoon, I slid the brass key back into my pocket. It no longer felt heavy with mystery. It felt like armor. A piece of Laura's love and foresight that would keep me standing when others tried to push me down. Tell me if you uncovered a home built in secret by the person who knew you best. Would you keep it hidden as a sanctuary? Or would you confront those who had forgotten your worth? When I returned home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that Laura's plan was larger than a single house. I laid the deed on my desk, turned on the lamp, and studied the bold print of my name again and again. Why would she keep something so significant from me? unless she knew David and Melissa would eventually come sniffing around. That thought unsettled me more than the empty Christmas table ever had. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was a warning. The next morning, I carried the folder and the brass key to Carl's hardware store. His place smelled of wood smoke and oil, the kind of scent that clings to a man's clothes after years of honest work. He set aside his newspaper when I walked in. "You've got that look again, George," he said, adjusting his flannel sleeves, "like the world's heavier than you can carry." I handed him the deed. "Tell me if I'm seeing this right." Carl scanned it, his glasses sliding down his nose. He tapped the page with his finger. "This isn't just a property, George. This is a wall. Laura put this house in your name only. No joint ownership. No trail leading back to David. Legally, this is yours alone. And that means no one else can touch it. Not your son, not his wife, not even a court, without your say-so." His words settled over me like a blanket, heavy but protective. "Why would she do all this?" I asked. Carl leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Because she saw what you didn't. People don't separate property like this unless they're shielding it from something. Could be taxes, creditors, or family disputes. Family disputes." The phrase lingered in the air between us, sharper than any tool hanging on Carl's wall. I thought about Melissa's voice always answering for David, about her quiet suggestions that she help with the bills when Laura was in the hospital, about how David rarely spoke for himself anymore. I'd brushed it all off as kindness, as busyness, but maybe Laura had seen the truth that they were circling. Carl poured us both coffee from the pot he kept on the back counter. "George, I've seen too many families torn apart because someone wanted control. Laura wasn't leaving you a surprise, she was leaving you leverage. She made sure you'd never be cornered." I sipped the bitter coffee and let his words sink in. Leverage. That wasn't something I'd ever thought I needed with my own son. Yet here I was, holding proof that my wife had known better. When I left the shop, the winter sun had slipped lower, glinting off the snow. I tucked the deed back under my arm, the brass key clinking against my pocket. For the first time since Laura's death, I didn't feel like a man drifting toward irrelevance. I felt anchored, prepared. Tell me if your spouse's foresight gave you undeniable proof that your own child might betray you, would you confront them immediately, or wait until they revealed their true hand? 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from a man named Gerald Benton in an office above a small bakery downtown. The smell of warm bread drifted up the stairwell, a comfort I didn't expect, on a day I was about to uncover another piece of Laura's secret. Benton was sharp-eyed, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights as he adjusted the folder I had brought. "You were Laura Whitman's husband," he said, more statement than question. I nodded. "She left me this deed and mentioned your name in her notes. Something about a trust." He opened the folder with steady hands, flipping through the pages as if he already knew what he would find. Every so often he paused, marking sections with a pencil. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at me. "Yes, this is exactly what I thought it might be. Your wife set up a private trust 5 years ago, in your name only." I leaned forward. "Private trust, what does that mean for me?" "It means," he said slowly, "that you alone control it. There are no successor trustees, no joint holders, no hidden beneficiaries. It's airtight. No one, not your son, not your daughter-in-law, has any claim to it. And from the way this is structured, it was designed to protect you specifically." My throat tightened. Why didn't she tell me? Benton's mouth curved into something like sympathy. Because she didn't want you to feel like you needed it. She said it was only to be explained if circumstances shifted. Her words, not mine. I sat back stunned. Laura had seen it all: my grief, David's drift, Melissa's influence. She hadn't wanted to burden me with suspicion, but she had prepared for the storm she knew was coming. "How much is in it?" I asked, finally. He named a figure that made my pulse skip. More than enough to ensure my independence for the rest of my days. More than enough to ensure that David and Melissa couldn't touch me, no matter how hard they tried. "She wanted you to be safe," Benton said, "to have choices when others might try to take them away." I let the words settle heavier than the trust documents themselves. Safe. Laura had known that someday I might not be. She had seen this betrayal long before I dared to admit it. When I left Benton's office, the winter air cut through my coat, sharp and bracing. But in my pocket was the weight of certainty, the cabin key, the deed, and now the knowledge of a trust that no one could steal from me. For the first time since Christmas Day, I wasn't haunted by the image of David at another table. Instead, I carried the quiet strength of Laura's foresight. "Tell me if you discovered your late spouse had built a financial fortress around you. Would you feel sorrow for the distrust it implied, or gratitude for the protection it gave?" For a few days, I carried the trust papers everywhere, folded neatly inside my jacket. They weren't just documents, they were a shield. At night, I'd lay them on the desk beside Laura's photo, as if showing her I understood what she had done. Every time my eyes landed on her handwriting, the weight of grief lessened just a little, replaced by something stronger: resolve. That resolve was tested sooner than I expected. 3 mornings after my meeting with Benton, I heard tires crunching over the gravel outside my house. Through the window, I saw David's silver SUV pull into the driveway. He got out slowly, hands shoved in his pockets, wearing that stiff half-smile he always used when he wanted something. Melissa sat in the passenger seat, eyes glued to her phone. She didn't even look up. When I opened the door, David shifted on the porch. "Hey, Dad," he said. I leaned against the frame, my voice even. "We could have talked at Christmas. You didn't show up." His smile faltered, but only for a moment. "About that. Melissa's mom, it just made sense this year. But I wanted to check in now, see how you're doing." He hesitated, "And maybe talk about some things." I raised an eyebrow. "Things you know, Mom's stuff. The accounts. The boxes in the garage." He glanced toward the SUV, then back at me. "Melissa and I have been thinking maybe we could help you sort through everything. Streamline it. Make sure nothing slips through the cracks." There it was, the real reason for his visit. I let the silence hang long enough for him to squirm. Finally, I stepped back and gestured for him to come in. He walked into the living room, glancing around like he was sizing up the place. He sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, trying to look casual. I took my recliner, the chair that had always been mine. "Tell me more about this help you're offering," I said. David cleared his throat. "We've just read about how vulnerable older folks can be to mistakes. We thought maybe it'd be good to move some accounts around, consolidate things, keep it all organized." I leaned forward, my eyes on him. "Older folks, huh?" He froze, then tried to laugh it off. "I didn't mean yes, you did," I cut in, my voice steady. "Tell me something, David. Did you know Melissa forged my name on a $15,000 check a couple of years ago? Paid one of her contractors in Tennessee." His head jerked up, eyes wide. "What? No, don't lie." I watched his jaw tighten as he looked away. That was answer enough. "You weren't checking in on me," I said quietly. "You were checking on what I have." For the first time, David didn't meet my eyes. His shoulders slumped just slightly, the truth weighing on him heavier than he wanted to admit. "Tell me, if your own child came to your door, not for your company but for your possessions, would you shut him out forever, or would you wait and see just how far he'd go?" The word help lingered in the air long after David left that afternoon. I sat in my recliner, staring at the empty space where he had sat, and realized how bitter it sounded coming from his mouth. Help wasn't what he wanted. He wanted access, control. For years, I'd ignored the signs the way Melissa answered my questions before David could, the way she offered to handle the bills during Laura's hospital stays, the way my son grew quieter whenever she was in the room. I told myself it was just marriage compromise, but Laura had seen what I wouldn't. That's why she'd left me the house, the trust, the leverage. She knew help was nothing more than a leash. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the halls of my house, the clock ticking like a reminder of every second that passed. When I finally sat back down by the fire, I heard the low rumble of an engine outside. I pulled back the curtain. A black sedan sat across the street, headlights off, idling. My chest tightened. It didn't move for 10 minutes. Just sat there, a shadow waiting. When it finally drove off, I felt no relief, only the certainty that someone was watching. The next morning, I walked to Carl's hardware store, the folder with Laura's deed under my arm. Carl looked up as I entered, the bell above the door jingling. "You look like a man with a storm behind him," he said. "There was a car outside my place last night," I told him. "Didn't move for 10 minutes. You know whose it might be?" Carl frowned. "Not one I recognize. But I'll tell you this. David was in here 2 days ago. Wanted to know if I had a trailer he could borrow. Said you'd probably be downsizing soon." The word hit me like a punch. Downsizing. It wasn't just a slip. It was preparation. Clearing me out. I steadied my voice. "And what did you tell him?" I told him if you needed a trailer, you'd call me yourself. Carl's eyes narrowed. "George, you know what this means, right? He's planning something." I nodded slowly, the reality sinking in. Laura's trust and the cabin weren't just protections. They were lifelines, because my own son was maneuvering against me. That afternoon, I walked through Laura's study again, searching every drawer, every shelf. In the bottom of one, under a stack of magazines, I found a folder labeled in her handwriting, "Household Private." Inside were tax returns, insurance statements, and a list titled, "Accounts George." Some had my name alone. One entry, however, stopped me cold. "Benton and Associates Trust, 2941. Ask Carl if needed." I sat back, the folder heavy in my lap. Laura hadn't just given me a house. She'd given me a fortress of assets, carefully hidden until the moment I needed them. Tell me if you discovered your own child was already planning your downsizing. Would you confront him immediately? Or would you let him make the next move so you could see just how deep the betrayal ran? 2 days later, the black sedan returned. This time it parked even closer, right across from my mailbox, the engine humming low. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee mug, acting casual, but my eyes never left the outline of the man behind the wheel. Dark coat head bent, pretending to read a newspaper. He stayed for 10 minutes, maybe longer, before pulling away. My gut told me this wasn't random. Someone had sent him. By noon, I was back in Carl's hardware store. The old bell rang as I pushed through the door. Carl looked up from the counter, suspicion already written on his face. "You see that sedan again?" I nodded. "Same one. Same man." Carl leaned in. "George, I'll tell you something else. Your son came by again last week, asking questions. Wanted to know if you had started clearing out your garage. Said you were probably thinking of selling the house." The words felt like acid in my ears. Selling the house. Downsizing. It was as if David had already written me out of my own life. I clenched my jaw. He's planning to take over. Carl gave a slow nod. Sounds that way. When I got home, the silence pressed down harder than usual. I went straight to Laura's study, and pulled out that household private folder again. My eyes went to the line Benton and Associates Trust 2941. I hadn't called Benton yet, but now I knew I had to. I dialed Carl and asked if he knew the name. He hesitated, then said, "Yeah. Gerald Benton, old school accountant. I've sent clients his way before. If Laura put him in her papers, there's a reason. You want me to set something up." The next morning, I sat in Benton's office, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery below drifting in. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the papers Laura had left me. "Yes," he said finally, "your wife set up a private trust 5 years ago. It's entirely under your name. No successor trustee, no co-holder. She structured it so no one, not even your son, can lay a claim." The relief hit me first, then the sorrow. Laura had seen this betrayal coming long before I did. She hadn't wanted to tell me, maybe because she knew I would deny it, cling to hope that David would never cross such a line. But she'd known, and she'd built a fortress around me while I was too blind to see the danger. When I left Benton's office, the papers under my arm, the winter air felt sharper, cleaner. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't waiting to be erased. I had a weapon they couldn't touch. Still, the black sedan lingered in my mind. Whoever sat behind that wheel wasn't finished. And neither was David. Tell me if you caught your child watching your life like a hawk circling with lawyers and cars and whispers, would you cut him off completely, or would you let him keep circling until he trapped himself? The knock at my door came 3 mornings later. Not the polite kind, but sharp and official. When I opened it, a man in a beige windbreaker stood there holding a clipboard. "Mr. Whitman?" he asked. "Yes." He handed me a thick envelope. "Delivery from the county court. You'll want to read it carefully." Without waiting for a signature, he turned and walked back down the steps. The sound of his car door slamming shut echoed in my chest. I carried the envelope into the kitchen, laid it on the table, and slid it open with a shaky hand. My eyes scanned the first page, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Petition for guardianship. Filed by David and Melissa, they claimed I was no longer capable of managing my personal or financial affairs. They listed supposed examples, unpaid bills, confusion with bank passwords, even an incident of leaving the stove on. Half were outright lies, the other half twisted half-truths. My hands clenched as I read on. They were painting me as incompetent a man, too far gone to manage his own life. I called Della Morgan immediately, the name Laura had scribbled in her notes in case of trouble. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and steady. After I read the first paragraph, she said, "They've moved faster than I expected. Guardianship petitions can be dangerous. They're easier to get than most people realize, especially if the court believes you're isolated." "I'm not isolated," I said. "I have friends, neighbors, Carl Ellen at the store." "Yes," she interrupted gently. "But they're building a picture that you are, and unless we get ahead of it, that picture becomes reality in the judge's eyes." By noon, I was sitting in her office, the petition spread across her desk. She tapped her pen against the page where the cabin was listed. "See here. They're claiming this property is at risk of neglect if left under your control. That tells me exactly what they're after. This isn't about your well-being, it's about unlocking assets." Her eyes were sharp as she closed the folder. "Here's what we do. We create our paper trail. Medical clearance proving you're competent. Bank records showing you manage your own accounts. And witnesses who can testify to your clarity. Every little thing counts. If we give the court a thicker stack of evidence than theirs, we win before the hearing even begins." I sat back, the weight of the papers pressing down like stone. "And if we lose," Della met my eyes, "then you lose control of everything." For the first time in years, anger surged hotter than grief. They hadn't just skipped Christmas dinner. They were trying to erase me from my own life. Tell me, if your own child filed papers to declare you incapable, would you fight tooth and nail in court? Or would you let the law decide whether your voice still mattered? The next morning, Della and I began what she called building the wall. It started at the bank. Mrs. Alvarez, the manager, had known Laura and me for years. When we explained what we needed, she didn't hesitate. George has been in here every month making his deposits himself, she told us. I can print the records that show his signature, his visits, his transactions. She slid the papers across the counter with a firm nod. You're not the man they're describing. From there, we went straight to Dr. Keller's office. He'd been my doctor for over a decade, and he gave me a full examination, reflexes, memory questions, even had me write a few sentences. When it was over, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. George, you're as sharp as I've ever seen you. I'll put it in writing. Cognitive capacity fully intact. He shook my hand. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. By mid-afternoon, we had a stack of records, financial statements, a doctor's certification, and even my tax filings that showed I had signed and filed without assistance. But Della wasn't done. Paper is strong, she said, but people are stronger. We need witnesses, neighbors, shopkeepers, folks who see you functioning day to day. I thought for a moment, then nodded. Ellen from the hardware store, Raj from the grocery, maybe Mark from the veterans' breakfast. Perfect, she said. Variety matters. We'll get written statements notarized. The more ordinary the interactions, the harder they are to dismiss. We stopped first at Raj's store. He came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands. George, what brings you in? When I explained, his expression darkened. They're saying you can't manage your own life. That's nonsense. You're in here every week, comparing prices, catching my mistakes. Half my younger customers don't pay that much attention. He scribbled a statement on the spot, signed it with a flourish, and said, You let me know if they try anything else. At the hardware store, Ellen shook her head in disbelief. I've seen you repair things most men half your age wouldn't touch. You know what you're doing, George. I'll write whatever you need. By the time the sun set, we had 3 sworn statements and a folder thick with evidence. Della spread it all across her desk, her eyes scanning each page. This is good, she said. This is very good. When the court sees this, they'll have to ask themselves, are the plaintiffs concerned children or opportunists chasing control? I sat back exhausted, but steadier than I'd felt in weeks. Laura's words echoed in my mind. Don't be afraid to let them think they're winning until you're ready to show them they're not. Tell me, if someone tried to strip you of your independence, would you trust documents and witnesses to defend you? Or would you take matters into your own hands, no matter the cost? Over the next week, I followed Della's instructions like a soldier preparing for battle. Every small action became a brick in the wall we were building. I made a list of errands and carried them out in public, buying supplies at the hardware store, paying my utility bills in person, even attending the veterans' breakfast I had skipped for months. Each handshake, each conversation was deliberate. Not just living my life, but proving it. Melissa must have noticed. Word travels fast in a small town, and soon Carl told me she had been asking questions. She'd walked into his store with a clipboard of all things and asked if anyone had noticed me acting confused lately. Carl said he kept his tone neutral, but told her straight. George is sharper than most men half his age. She didn't like that. I could picture the way her lips pressed thin, the way she probably made a note anyway, determined to twist things to fit her narrative. That night I sat in Laura's study and found another sealed envelope I had overlooked. My name was written in her familiar loops. Inside was a single line, trust Della. And don't be afraid to let them think they're winning until you're ready to show them they're not. My hands tightened on the paper. She had seen it all, the lies, the manipulation, the slow erosion of my place in my own family. And she had left me the one thing they never expected, a plan. The following morning, I opened my mailbox to find another thick envelope. This time it was an emergency addendum to the petition. They claimed I had been making financially reckless decisions. They listed the sale of my old pickup and the donation I had made to the Veterans Fund as proof of instability. Reading their words, I almost laughed. Selling a truck I didn't need and giving money to a cause I believed in wasn't recklessness, it was common sense. Still, their tactic was clear. They wanted to paint me as impulsive, careless, incapable. But for every line they wrote, Della had an answer. I pulled the bill of sale for the pickup from my files, neatly signed and notarized. I found the correspondence with the Veterans Fund, outlining the annual donation Laura and I had always made together. When I showed them to Della, she smiled faintly. "This is exactly what I hoped you had. They're not building a case, George, they're building smoke. And we're going to blow it away in court." That evening I sat by the fire, Laura's letters spread across the coffee table. I thought about the Christmas dinner that had started it all, the note Melissa had sent, with a courier, the empty chair where my son should have been. What began as heartbreak had become something sharper, clarity. They wanted me to feel weak, to doubt myself, to question my worth. But Laura had left me reminders at every turn that I was still capable, still strong, still alive. Tell me, if your own family tried to turn your life into evidence against you, would you break under the weight of betrayal? Or would you use their lies as fuel to prove the truth? The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee when I walked in that January morning. I dressed in my best jacket, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself and everyone else that I was still a man in control of his own life. Della walked beside me, calm and composed, carrying the thick folder of evidence we had built brick by brick. Across the aisle, David and Melissa sat with their attorney, a slick man in a navy suit, who looked more like he was auditioning for a commercial than representing justice. Melissa's red nails tapped impatiently against the table while David kept fiddling with his tie. They both looked confident, maybe even smug, as if this was already a done deal. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge, a woman in her 60s with a steady gaze that could cut through steel, took her seat. David's attorney rose first, his voice smooth, practiced. "Your Honor, my clients are deeply concerned for the well-being of Mr. Whitman. They have observed troubling patterns, impulsive financial decisions, confusion over documents, and attempts to transfer property under questionable circumstances. They seek guardianship to ensure his safety and preserve his estate." He sat down with a flourish, like a magician who had just finished his trick. Melissa patted David's hand, smiling as if the case was already closed. Then Della stood. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words filled the room. "Your Honor, what you just heard was not concern. It was a calculated attempt to strip a capable man of his autonomy. We will demonstrate that Mr. Whitman is fully competent, that his decisions were thoughtful and consistent, and that the real motive here is control over his assets, specifically a lakeside cabin that has been in his family for decades." The judge nodded for her to proceed. Della began with the documents. She placed the notarized bill of sale for my old pickup truck on the bench. This was not an impulsive act. It was planned, signed, and witnessed. Then came the donation receipt for the Veterans Fund, accompanied by correspondence showing it was part of an annual tradition Laura and I had maintained for years. Piece by piece, the so-called reckless decisions evaporated into responsible choices. Melissa shifted in her seat, her smile faltering. David kept his eyes fixed on the floor. I watched from my chair, silent but steady. For the first time, the balance of power in the room seemed to shift. This wasn't just about defending myself. It was about reclaiming the dignity they had tried to take. Tell me, if you were sitting in that courtroom accused of being unfit to handle your own life, would you stay silent and let your evidence speak, or would you stand up and tell the truth with your own voice? The judge leaned back in her chair, eyes moving from the papers on her bench to me. "Mr. Whitman, you may remain seated for now," she said, "but I will want to hear from you later." Her tone was even but firm. I gave a small nod. My hands stayed folded, calm, though inside my pulse hammered like a drum. Della moved to the next stage of our wall, the witnesses. She called Ellen from the hardware store first. Ellen stood tall, voice steady as she swore the oath. "I've known George for over 20 years, she told the court. "He comes into my store regularly. Just last week he bought parts to fix a leaky faucet and discussed details with me clearly. If he's confused, I've never seen it." Her testimony was simple, unembellished, but the truth rang through. Next was Raj from the grocery. He adjusted his tie nervously before speaking, but his words came out sharp. "George is in my store every week. He compares prices, checks, expiration dates, even corrects me when I mislabel something. He is sharper than half the younger folks I see. Reckless, no, careful and deliberate." I watched Melissa out of the corner of my eye. She shifted her jaw tight, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. David's shoulders slumped just slightly, though he avoided my gaze. Their attorney scribbled something on his pad, but the tension in his movements gave him away. Then came Mark from the veterans' breakfast. He wore his old service jacket, the patches still bright. "I've sat beside George for years," he told the court. "Last month he organized our raffle, kept the books balanced, and teased me about my lousy handwriting. That's not a man who's lost his grip, that's a man holding the reins." Each testimony was like another stone stacked on the wall, closing off the cracks Melissa and David had tried to carve. By the time Mark stepped down, the judge's expression had shifted. She wasn't convinced yet, but she was listening. David's lawyer rose, trying to regain ground. "Mr. Raj," he said, "isn't it true that older customers often seem fine in casual interactions, but still struggle privately?" Raj didn't flinch. "Maybe some do, but not George. I've seen him handle his business with clarity. If you're looking for confusion, you won't find it in him." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even the judge's mouth twitched at the firmness of Raj's reply. Della glanced at me, her eyes steady as if to say, "Our wall is holding." For the first time since that Christmas night, I didn't feel like a man abandoned. I felt like a man seen. "Tell me, if your reputation and independence were on trial, would you trust friends and neighbors to defend you? Or would you insist on standing alone against the storm?" The tide shifted when Della called Carl to the stand. He walked forward in his pressed flannel, broad-shouldered and steady, the kind of man whose word carried weight without flourish. After swearing the oath, he looked directly at the judge, not at David or Melissa. "Mr. Thompson, Della began. You mentioned to me you overheard a conversation involving the plaintiffs. Could you share that with the court?" Carl's voice was plain, unshaken. "Yes, ma'am. I was at the Ridgeway storage facility dropping off tools when I heard Melissa talking to David," she said, and I quote, "Once we have the papers signed, we can list the cabin and split the money before spring. He'll thank us later when he's somewhere safe." The courtroom went utterly silent. Melissa's head snapped toward David, her eyes wide. David flushed crimson, his jaw tight, as if he wanted to object, but couldn't find the words. Their attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection, hearsay," the judge raised her hand. "Overruled." The witness gave a direct account of what he heard. "Continue." Carl leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. Didn't sound like concern for his well-being to me. Sounded like they were planning a sale. The air in the room seemed to change. It wasn't just testimony anymore, it was intent laid bare. The picture Melissa and David had painted of caring children trying to protect an aging father cracked like thin ice under too much weight. I watched the judge carefully. Her expression remained composed, but I saw the faint tightening around her mouth, the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew the truth. Melissa whispered furiously to David, who shook his head and looked away. For the first time, the confidence drained from their faces. Their lawyer shuffled his papers, his rehearsed lines slipping from his grip. Della let the silence sit before she spoke again. Your Honor, the plaintiffs claim their concern is for Mr. Whitman's safety. But as we just heard, their own words reveal otherwise. Their goal is access to his assets, specifically the lakeside cabin, which they cannot inherit or control without stripping him of his autonomy. She placed the trust document for the cabin on the judge's bench. This property is protected by a trust established years ago. It cannot be sold, transferred, or touched without Mr. Whitman's explicit consent. The plaintiffs knew this, and their frustration is what brings us here today. Melissa's face blanched. David buried his face in his hands. From my seat, I felt something I hadn't in months: vindication. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had betrayed themselves with their own words. Tell me if you heard your child openly plotting to sell what you built. Would you feel anger burning hotter than love, or relief that their mask had finally slipped in front of everyone? The judge studied the trust document Della had placed before her. She adjusted her glasses, scanning each page with deliberate care. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint shuffling of papers. When she finally looked up, her gaze was steady, cutting straight through the plaintiff's case. This document appears valid and binding, she said. It clearly outlines Mr. Whitman's sole authority. Counsel, do you dispute this? David's lawyer shifted in his seat, his voice suddenly less polished. Your Honor, while the trust may exist, it doesn't negate the broader concerns for Mr. Whitman's ability to manage his affairs. The judge raised a hand. We'll address capacity separately. But what I see here is a legally protected asset immune from your client's control. That undermines the very foundation of your petition. Melissa's face twisted, red nails digging into the armrest. David leaned back, his lips pressed into a thin line. Their polished facade had cracked, and no amount of rehearsed lines could patch it. Della seized the moment. Your Honor, the plaintiffs presented a narrative of concern, but the evidence shows a calculated effort to seize assets. Their own words, overheard by a credible witness, reveal intent to sell the cabin. That is not care, it is exploitation. The judge turned to me. Mr. Whitman, would you like to address the court? I rose slowly, steadying myself with a breath. Your Honor, I am 72 years old. I have lived through loss, through hard work, through decades of paying my bills on time. I am not perfect, but I am capable of making my own choices. My wife and I built that cabin as a place for family, not as a bargaining chip. If my son and daughter-in-law cannot accept that it is their choice, but they do not get to erase mine. The words left me calmer than I expected. The courtroom was silent, every eye on me. For once, I didn't feel like the man left behind at Christmas. I felt like the man Laura had believed in all along. David's lawyer tried to recover, flipping through his notes. But Your Honor, patterns of forgetfulness. The judge cut him off. Patterns of independence are what I see here. Bank records, medical evaluations, sworn witness testimony, all indicating competence. And now a trust that makes it abundantly clear these assets were safeguarded intentionally. Della leaned close and whispered, "We've got them." I stayed standing a moment longer, watching my son's face. David wouldn't look at me. Melissa glared, her eyes full of venom, but she said nothing. Their silence was louder than any argument. Tell me, if the law laid your freedom and dignity back in your own hands, would you feel triumphant, or would you grieve for the family that tried to steal them away? The judge leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the bench. For a long moment she said nothing, letting the weight of the evidence fill the room. Finally, her voice broke the silence. After reviewing the petition, the supporting evidence, and the testimony presented, I find no grounds to grant guardianship over Mr. Whitman. On the contrary, the evidence shows he is competent to manage his affairs. Furthermore, I am issuing a protective order to prevent further interference with his property or financial decisions. Her gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed like thunder in my chest. I didn't realize I had been holding my breath until it escaped in a slow exhale. Across the aisle, Melissa's face drained of color, her lips parting as if to protest, but no words came. David's shoulders sagged. He didn't look at me, didn't look at the judge, he simply stared at the floor, as though the weight of his choices had finally settled on him. Their lawyer began stuffing papers into his briefcase, his polished composure gone. Della placed a hand on my arm and whispered, "It's over." As we left the courthouse, the winter sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. The cold air stung my cheeks, but inside I felt light, almost buoyant. Carl clapped me on the shoulder at the bottom of the steps. "You held your ground, George. Laura would be proud." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Proud, that was the word I carried with me all the way home. For months I had felt like a ghost in my own life, unwanted, erased. But today the law had reminded me that I still mattered, that my voice was not just heard, but respected. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, the house quiet around me. Laura's photograph on the counter caught the lamplight, her smile warm and steady. I imagined her saying what she always did when I doubted myself. "George, you've got more strength than you think." I didn't celebrate with champagne or victory speeches. I didn't need to. The victory was in the silence, the kind that no longer pressed down like loneliness, but lifted me like a promise. My life was still mine. My choices were still mine. And no petition, no courtroom, no betrayal could take that from me. Later, I walked into Laura's study and opened the drawer where the cabin key rested. I turned it in my hand, feeling the familiar weight. It was more than a key, it was proof that I was not powerless, that Laura had known my worth even when others tried to erase it. Tell me, if you walked out of a courtroom with your freedom intact and your dignity restored, would you savor the victory quietly, or would you confront those who tried to strip it from you one final time? In the weeks after the hearing, I realized the greatest victory wasn't the legal papers, or even the trust Laura had left me. It was the knowledge that I hadn't been erased. I still had a voice, a life, and the right to steer it as I saw fit. For too long, I'd let myself believe that being left out of family dinners meant I had no value left. But Laura's foresight, Della's guidance, and the quiet support of neighbors reminded me that dignity doesn't come from who sits at your table, it comes from how firmly you protect your seat. I've since decided to turn the Hendersonville cabin into something greater than myself, a retreat for veterans and their families. A place of rest, not a bargaining chip. Laura would have wanted that. And for me, it feels like a way to honor her trust, while ensuring the property never falls into the wrong hands. If you're a parent listening to this, maybe you've felt that sting, that fear of being sidelined or dismissed by your own children. My story is a reminder, your worth isn't defined by their choices, but by the strength you carry forward. Have you ever faced betrayal from the ones closest to you? How did you respond, and what did you learn from it? Share your story in the comments. If this touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Remember, respect is the true inheritance we leave behind. Thank you for listening.